evening. I'm Catharine Richert. You're listening to NPR News. We're glad you could join us tonight for this special live call-in show. Over the past 2 months, Minnesota has seen thousands of federal agents doing what President Trump's administration calls immigration enforcement in the Twin Cities. It's also happening in smaller communities around the state. Those actions have become increasingly violent as ICE observers have been pepper sprayed, U.S. citizens have been detained, and children have been deported. People afraid of being detained by ICE are hiding in their homes, foregoing school, work, and health care. And in 2 tragic cases, these confrontations have been deadly. ICE observers Renee Macklin-Good and Alex Preddy were both fatally shot by federal agents just weeks apart. State officials are challenging the federal government's enforcement actions in the courts, and they're pleading with the White House to stop its operation here. We know that there's been a change in the Trump administration's leadership on the ground here this week, but it's still very unclear when and how this will end. So tonight, we'll talk with 2 Minnesotans about the moment that we're living through, what it means for the history of our state and our nation, and where we go from here. Both of my guests are Minnesotans you may know well from their writing and from social media. Sharon McMahon is known to her fans as America's government teacher. She is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Small and Mighty, and the creator of The Preamble. That's a weekly magazine reaching more than 350,000 readers. Her new children's book, We Are Mighty, will be published in May. She's joining us tonight from Duluth. Thank you so much for being with us, Sharon.
So happy to be here.
We also have Dillon White. He is an attorney and former constitutional law professor at Minnesota State University, Mankato. He's also the creator of the Constitutional Law Meets Parenting Substack called On Law and Littles, and the persona behind Dad Chats on TikTok and on Instagram. Thank you for being here, Dillon.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Okay, we're going to be taking your questions this hour with both of our guests. We want to know, when you look at what's happening in Minnesota right now, what questions does it raise for you? What do you think about this moment and what it says about us and where this country is headed? Call us at 651-227-6000 or 800-242-2828. So I want to get both of your impressions on just like the last 24 hours here. The news earlier this week was that President Trump said he plans to de-escalate ICE's presence in Minnesota. His administration also announced a changing of the guard in their immigration crackdown here. Border Czar Tom Homan has arrived to take the lead. He replaced Border Patrol Commander Gregory Bavino. State and city leaders, including Governor Walz, have met with Homan. There seems to be maybe some cautious optimism in the tone and tenor of how we're talking about those conversations. But Dillon, I'm wondering how significant of a shift that you think this is.
I think probably best described as, at least from what I'm seeing and what I've heard and felt, is it feels a little bit like an emotional pause, but maybe not so much, at least yet, sort of a tangible one. I think, though, that might be colored a little bit by the fact that, due to the nature of social media and the fact that we were in such a groundswell to begin with, that as this is happening, I think we were in a position where we're still getting information and seeing videos and getting calls and texts from instances that happened within the last 72 hours. So some of that is sort of still carrying over, and it's a little bit unclear, I think, how the next few weeks are going to look. I mean, from a personal perspective, I probably was one of many Minnesotans that took a deep breath. And then I think when we kind of woke up the next morning and looked around and said, I'm not sure what's changed yet, but we felt hope for the first time in a while.
Sharon, I want to get your impression as well. What have you been thinking about since Gregory Bavino left, Tom Homan arrived?
Well, it's obviously intended to be a symbolic gesture. Whether or not it will actually result in changed behavior on the part of ICE agents and Border Patrol in Minnesota, very much, as Dillon is saying, remains to be seen. But obviously the tenor of the rhetoric, the placing of the 2 officers who shot Alex Preddy on leave, the idea that, people are saying, we're going to have a fair investigation. It's at least nodding to the fact that the groundswell has become sort of uncontainable and is not looking good.
Do you think it is the things you just described, including both of those officers being put on leave, do you feel like that is symbolic, or is there actually some significance to that happening, Sharon?
It's both. They should have been put on leave the moment after it happened. That's normal procedure is for an officer involved shooting, regardless of whether or not it is found to have been justified. That officer is placed on leave so that an investigation can happen. So it should have happened sooner, and there's no excuse for it not to. So I do think there's a symbolic gesture in announcing that they're on leave rather than just quietly putting them on leave. But I do think it means something that they're on leave and they at least appear to be looking into it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right, obviously, and there is sort of a familiarity to that, for better or for worse. I think in Minnesota we're obviously used to some of this storyline, and I think seeing the headlines about being put on leave, that automatically triggers in a lot of us a normalcy. Although I hate to use that word for this specific incident or any of these incidents, but we're used to that as being part of the process. To Sharon's point, so seeing that, I think that sort of triggers that part in our brain that makes us think, oh gosh, maybe this is going to be what we're used to, quote unquote, because we know that that's a part of the process when things like this unfortunately happen.
So, Dillon, I know you from your Instagram account, where I think of you as the dad who's sort of breaking down the news of the day from the front seat of his car, drinking some coffee. But you, of course,
which I'm doing right now. Yes,
yeah, right. You are drinking coffee right now. You are an attorney. You are a constitutional law. You've taught constitutional law. You've also been helping people who've been detained by ICE. Tell us a little bit more about that. What are you seeing, and is that still happening?
Yes, it is. I sort of fell into that aspect of it a little bit by accident. I think like a lot of Minnesotans, I was sitting there thinking, I know I want to do something. I have all this pent up sort of passion and frustration and impetus to do something. And then just sort of by happenstance, I actually got a call from the wife of someone who's on social. And she called me and was like, hey, I don't know what to do. My husband has been detained. And I, obviously, being in the position that I'm in, I get a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails, and I just sort of happened to see this one, and something in my brain was like, I think this is real. And so I called her back. I drove out there. We spent a couple hours trying to figure out what happened, what went on. We finally figured out where he was, and then we went down to Whipple. I'm not a criminal defense attorney. I didn't even stay at a Holiday Inn Express. So
the
I can't
Whipple
pretend
building
to,
is
yes.
the place where people are being
Yep.
taken once they've been detained. Yeah, go ahead.
And so I called a criminal defense attorney of mine. We went down together. And I mean, I will say, so this was Monday of, I've lost all track of time, I guess 2 weeks ago. This was before they started denying access to attorneys. And my criminal defense friend, we were sitting in this room that they put you in while you're waiting. And no joke, probably 4 people came and talked to us and asked what we needed, who we were there for, how they could help. And I turned to my friend who's been doing this for 50 years. And he was like, I thought we were going to be here for 9 hours and no one was going to speak to us. This is very strange how over the top accommodating they're being. And then within 3 days after that, that's when we started to get calls from people that were not allowed to see their attorneys anymore.
So they were not allowed to see their attorneys. What does that say to you?
It's worrisome. Obviously, the DHS's statements refute that, but that has not been the experience of any of the attorneys that we've worked with. They've still not been allowed access, at least as of yesterday, too.
Yeah.
I think it's possibly a slow trickle that perhaps it'll happen again, but it does worry me in terms of the process, especially we have these people that are detained without charging, and they're not allowed to speak to an attorney. And when they can, there's some sort of a weird requirement where if the attorney shows up, the person who's being detained has to be able to name who their attorney is, which, again, I'm not a criminal defense attorney, but any crim def person will tell you that never really happens in real life because most of these people have families that hire someone when, once they're in jail or prison. And so once that happens, you're not going to really know who your attorney's going to be. So when you show up and you don't know their name, that's pretty common.
Yeah. Sharon, I feel like we have been hearing a lot about threats to democracy. As someone who studies history and American government, do you think that is hyperbole?
Broadly speaking, across the nation, I don't. I don't think it's hyperbole. I do, however, think the North Star State is out here leading the way. and showing people what needs to happen if we want to actually stand up for our constitutional republic, if we actually want to put democracy on the ballot. This is what it's going to take. And, I'm not a doomsdayer. I'm not somebody who, if anybody's followed me for any period of time, they will know that I'm not somebody who gets on the internet every day screaming that the sky is falling. But I think to say that there are no there's no real and present danger to democracy in the United States is willfully burying your head in the sand.
You just used a word that I hear you use a lot, and that is that it's important to remember that we are a republic. What do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, I dislike it when people try to correct me and say, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. Those are just the facts. We are both a democracy and a republic.
If you're just joining our conversation, you may know my guests well from their writing and from social media. Sharon McMahon is known to her fans as America's government teacher. Instagram addicts like me might also know her as Sharon Says So. And we also have lawyer Dillon White. He is a former constitutional law professor and the persona behind dad chats on TikTok and Instagram. We're taking your questions about the moment that we are living through in Minnesota. When you look at what's happening in Minnesota right now, what questions does it raise for you? What do you think this moment says about us or where our country is headed? Call us at 651-227-6000 or 800-242-2828. We have Liz in South Minneapolis on the line. Liz, what do you want to share with us?
Hi there. Thanks, everyone. One quick comment I wanted to say was I think you should do a show where it's all call-in because the lines were jammed last night.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get it all. I also just wanted to say I agree we can't normalize this. I think there's been more than just the past 100 years, but 400 years of struggle and leadership that we all need to take reference from, and so that we don't reinvent the wheel, and how we approach our struggle here in Minnesota and the rest of the country. And then I did have a quick question for the guests. My question is, I understand that the state and city, county officials are trying to avoid a situation in which we become finding ourselves in a constitutional crisis, and I'll let the guests explain that to the listeners. I saw a statement read a story about Ramsey County providing guidance to law enforcement agencies to pursue charges or cases, as it were, against federal agents in town who have committed crimes or suspected of committed crimes, rather, and that they basically are looking at this on the basis of the state constitution and the United States Constitution. And so I look to what we've been told thus far from Governor Walz and Mayor Fry, and I wonder, at what point are they going to start bringing charges to the table? Mm-hmm. So doesn't been more than patient enough. We need to see our city and state leadership as Minneapolitans. Is that what we are?
Sure. Yeah.
Bringing charges, allowing law enforcement to bring charges as well. Why hasn't that happened? Is this a legal question?
Yeah, this is an important legal question. It's one we've been talking about and discussing a lot. Dillon, lay out for us a little bit of some of the legal levers that are available, but also maybe some of the legal challenges in doing this.
Yeah, for sure. So a couple different levels. First, awesome comments, and thanks for the question, Liz. One of the things that's been thrown back and forth a little bit with regard to some of the more high-profile instances is, it is challenging to bring some of the civil rights cases against federal agents, versus on a state level. Some of those laws are sort of easier to navigate, and a lot of that is because of Supreme Court precedent with Bivens. And the difficulty in bringing these 1983 cases just by nature of who the actor is, right? So it's harder to go after a federal law enforcement officer. That said, that's because you'd be pursuing in that instance a case against someone who is a federal agent for a federal offense, right? They're still liable for any state infractions that they were to incur or to make. That said, it's one of those things where you have to actually catch them in the act of violating something that is a state law. And then at the same time, you also have to navigate the fact that there's been messaging from, about as high up as it comes that they are acting with impunity. That's not true in legal sense, but I think one of the things that we've sort of struggled with a lot as a society, especially here in Minneapolis, is navigating the difference between what's true in the legal sense and what's actually happening.
Sharon, Liz also brought up a good point in the opening of her comments there about, 400 years of struggle in the United States. And you had a really interesting post on your Instagram account the other day where you were drawing a connection between the current form of ICE enforcement and America's history with slavery and specifically slave catchers. Can you just say more about the similarities that you and other historians see there?
I would love to. And I would want to add one quick thing
Please,
to
yeah.
what Dillon is saying. Everything he's saying is absolutely correct. It's extremely difficult for state actors to prosecute the feds. But in addition to everything he said, there's another confounding factor of the federal government withholding access to any amount of evidence. And in order to be able to demonstrate that somebody is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, you need access to ballistics, to all of the medical examiner reports. You need access to all of the electronics and all of the entire battery of evidence you would need to compile in order to gain a conviction. And when that is withheld, it makes it nearly impossible for a local prosecutor to build a case against that individual. So it becomes not worth bringing, not from a moral sense, but from a practical logistical
And I just want to point out to Sharon, before you get to the next part, just to remind our listeners, 3 times now the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension has been blocked by federal authorities from collecting evidence, even with a signed judicial warrant at the Peretti scene. That didn't happen. Please go ahead, Sharon.
Yeah, and in some cases, the feds abandoning the scene, like they did at the Peretti scene, not holding the scene, so the scene is contaminated. But Liz is exactly right that the struggle that we are currently faced with is not a new one in the United States. What it is, and this is difficult for some people to hear, this struggle is newly apparent to many white Americans. This struggle is not newly apparent to most people of color who have been in the United States for any period of time. It is not a new struggle to Black Americans. It is not a new struggle to Asian Americans, Native Americans, and Hispanic Americans. These power dynamics that we are currently witnessing have come to light for people for whom they have never been an issue at this level. So I also totally agree with Liz's statement that we actually don't need to reinvent the wheel, that we have hundreds of years of people who have gone before us who have shown us how to build a multiracial democracy. Many of those people are Black women. That show us how to build a multiracial democracy, who have borne the weight of shouldering that weight on our behalf. And it's honestly time that we start looking to them for some leadership.
Dillon, you want to jump in?
And thanks for highlighting that. And I think also, just to kind of piggyback off that too, I think for a lot of us, and as someone that's done work in representing communities that need it, I think for a lot of us, this is also the first experience that we're seeing the system actively work against us. And I think we're seeing that a lot in the last week, even with Judge Schilt's opinion, or rather, declaration, that we're seeing a system where we know what we're supposed to have and we know what we're supposed to see, and judges are saying what's supposed to happen, and then it's not being followed, and it's not happening. And to Sharon's point, that's been happening to people who don't look like me for decades. And I think for a lot of us, we're starting to see that firsthand and realizing just how stacked against us the deck can really be.
And you mentioned Schiltz's opinion. That is a reference to a judge asking the head of ICE to come to court on Friday. Again, like the legal twists here feel sort of endless and they're hard to keep track of, but there's a lot going on in the courts. I want to go now to a caller from Columbia Heights. What do you want to share?
Well, first of all, I just want to express extreme gratitude to both of your guests. The reason I don't go off of social media is because you both are the perfect balance of heart and education. And what you've been sharing lately these past few weeks has just been invaluable. So thank you both very, very much for using your platforms for good and for encouragement, especially Sharon, you just posted today, like the light on the horizon is still a long way off. And I'm feeling that in Columbia Heights. It's been a surge of ICE agents all over our streets regularly. every few days. And we're getting weary. So we're recalibrating to keep our community safe, but it's now for the long haul is what it feels like. And I am
and that
very
has
concerned.
not abated. That has not abated in the last day or so?
No, it
Okay.
has not.
Thank you. Okay.
We just on Sunday had a reoccurrence of over 100 ICE agents in our 3x3 square mile city. So, and we have scouts. They're citizens who are mega followers who are also out on the streets intimidating observers and helpers, and now taking photos of our cars and our houses and following us home, circling our schools. It's just daunting at this point. And I am concerned because I really appreciate the comments of, yes, as a white woman, I'm now feeling it. But when our checks and balances are so strained and this administration continues to push against that fabric, is there recourse after this? And I'm concerned about what are the next steps when they're just complete contempt of court, like on the regular.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the next steps are for us.
Let me ask that question to Dillon here, and Sharon too. I mean, the caller raises a good question. If the court orders now are disregarded, I mean, where do we go from here?
Yeah, I don't know the answer because we've never really been in that situation before. But the short answer is a lot like our monetary system, I suppose. All of these things that we do on a judicial level and on a legislative level and as attorneys, it all relies on trust, and it relies on the fact that everyone is going to listen and going to follow whatever is said from the body that says it that we're supposed to respect. And to the point that she was just making, I don't know what that looks like if everyone just decides we don't care anymore. That's scary to me because I live in a world where you have to follow the rules. And if you don't follow the rules, oftentimes as simple as you use the wrong font, right? Or you use the wrong margins, you're told to get out and fix it. And so for me, I look at that question and that's my worst case scenario, is having to answer it because I don't know what the answer is. And I don't like A, not knowing the answer, but B, not even being able to say the classic, it depends. Because if we're in a situation where that happens, I don't think there is, it depends.
Yeah. And Sharon, I mean, constitutional crisis maybe feels more real to some people right now than it ever has. Help us understand. Well, I want to hear your take on it, but in a historical context, just kind of help us understand. Have we ever seen anything quite like this?
There are a few little hallmarks, little throwbacks way back into history in like the Andrew Jackson era, into the Civil War era, where we can see examples of individuals or even state actors defying court orders. We can see some examples of that. But what we have never seen is the federal government wholesale disregarding the rule of law. And to Dillon's point, we do not know where that ends. So I don't know how this story ends, but what I can tell you is that we get to be a part of writing how it ends. And the only way we get to be a part of writing how it ends is if we stay in the fight. If we abandon the battlefield, the proverbial battlefield, not the actual battlefield. I'm not encouraging any violence whatsoever, but if we abandon the proverbial battlefield, then we cede any power we have in writing how this story ends. And so my encouragement to the caller and to anybody listening would be to rest when you need to, reframe how you're helping people. How you're helping people today might need to change next week because your kid is sick or whatever life throws at you. But we must stay in the game or we will have no opportunity to write how this ends.
If you're just joining our conversation, you may know my guests well from their writing and from social media. Sharon McMahon is known to her fans as America's government teacher. On Instagram, she's known as Sharon Says So. And lawyer Dillon White is a former constitutional law professor and the persona behind Dad Chats on TikTok and Instagram. We're taking your questions this hour. When you look at what's happening in Minnesota right now, what questions does it raise for you? What do you think it says about the moment that we're in and where our country is headed? Call us at 651-227-6000 or 800-242-2828. Sharon, you touched on something that kind of reminded me of the title of your book, The Small and Mighty. And I'm wondering what that title means to you and how you think it may apply to the Minnesota that we're experiencing right now.
I think it absolutely applies to this moment. It's the notion that the course of history is changed by people without the traditional levers, access to the levers of power. It is the idea that small acts lead up to really big things if we refuse to quit and we keep doing the next needed thing. And that's something that we're seeing in Minnesota every day. I am friends with somebody on Facebook who is maybe a second-year teacher, maybe a third-year teacher. She's the daughter of one of my friends. And she just posted yesterday, like, I am working on getting food to some of the kids in my classroom. That's a fantastic example of doing the next needed thing, asking for help in that regard. I think what you're seeing right now is what many people have regarded as a flyover state, as like just basically an Antarctic research station where 42 of us live in a single building and wear parkas year round and we just dog sled to the poles. And that's all we do.
We have more fun than that.
Yeah. I've lived in both coasts and I can tell you that's kind of the impression that many people have of Minnesota. It's eternal winter and all we do is use dog sleds. And all we do is vote because there's nothing else to do. And I think what you're seeing right now is this awakening of something that many people have viewed as a very small, insignificant entity into something quite mighty. And that's a theme that is actually repeated throughout American history.
Yeah, Dillon, I mean, I feel like something I'm hearing, as much as I'm hearing about fear and concern, I'm also hearing a lot of people talk about how proud they are to be Minnesotans right now. And what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I often think, as a parent, I feel like I'm frequently thinking in terms of how do I view this as a lens to my kids. And one of the things that I keep going back to, at least personally, not just for this, but a lot of different things, is I'm always struck by there's this line in Frozen 2, right, where Anna says you got to do the next right thing, and that has always stuck with me with my kids too, because we're gonna mess up all the time. I mess up all the time, and the next thing I think to always ask yourself is how do I not make it worse, right? How do I make it better? And then later in the film, when Kristoff pulls up beside her and instead of saying like, what do you need? He just says, how can I help? And I think that question has driven so many Minnesotans for the last few weeks in ways that this is not the means by which any of us wanted to find a community-based identity. I think we can all agree on that. This is not fun. But I also think that there is a spirit and a resolve that the not just the nation but the world is starting to see. And when I wake up and I check my phone and I have 8 different news notifications from NPR, The Economist, The Atlantic, and they're all about Minneapolis, that's strange to me that we are now the focal point of so many flashpoints.
Sharon, I'm based in Rochester most of the time, although I'm in St. Paul right now. Dillon is in the Twin Cities. You're up in Duluth. Can you give us a snapshot of what this looks like outside of the metro area? Because you and I know well that it's not limited to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the surrounding areas. What have you been seeing in greater Minnesota?
Yeah. Large amounts of ICE enforcement, even in rural areas. Girl Scout troop leaders who work on Native American reservations contacting me saying, my troop does not feel safe selling cookies in the community because they largely have brown skin and they are afraid that their family members or themselves will be taken by ICE, and asking for advice on how we can sell Girl Scout cookies. It looks like ICE in Virginia, Minnesota, which is a very small, it's a small town by the nation standards, a small town on the Iron Range, conducting enforcement in a Mexican restaurant in this very small town, and then alleging that one of the workers tried to ram them with his vehicle, and they brought him up on federal charges. And then just this week, when he was brought into court, the charges had to be dropped because there was not one single ICE agent willing to testify about the alleged assault. They had no evidence of what actually happened, and that had to be dropped. But the fact remains that they were doing enforcement even in small towns, and they were willing to bring charges against an individual that then ended up being unsubstantiated. I can't speak to why they did that. Perhaps it was in hopes that he could be incarcerated by different means, other than being deported. I don't know the answer to that question. But it is certainly not, it is not contained to the Twin Cities Metro.
Yeah. We have, excuse me, we have Michelle in South Minneapolis on the line. Michelle, what do you want to share with us?
Well, I hear a lot of people talking on the radio. I listen to a lot of public radio and other talk shows, and I'm reading articles on the internet, and I'm talking to friends and family, and everyone's talking about rights. And I've noticed over the many years of my life, I'm in my 60s, that a lot of people talk about rights as though it means whatever they want it to mean. Rights are a concept. They're an idea, meaningless in effect unless they are both codified and enforced. At this moment in time in Minneapolis, we don't have rights because they can't be enforced.
Yeah. You can't see it, but Dillon is nodding his head here. What do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bone-chilling point. And I'd sort of made a similar point when first kind of developed the story about the lack of counsel at Whipple, which is, without the access to an attorney and without the access to counsel, all of the Constitution, to your point, becomes just conceptual. If there's no way to enforce those rights, if there's no means by which you're able to even tell someone what their rights are, then those rights don't exist anymore. They just become something in the ether that we once had. And I think I'm torn on the call because there is half of me that listens to it and goes, that is one of the most heartbreakingly brilliant things I've ever heard. And then there's another part of me that goes, we can't talk like that. Like, we can't do it. And it's not because I disagree, but it's because I don't want to live in that world where we talk about the rights that we used to have. And I'm not saying that your vantage point is wrong at all. I think it's 100% right. It just scares me so much that it's 100% right that in my brain, I can't go there. I can't let myself go there, because if we cede, and this is kind of what Sharon's talking about too, if we cede any ground on that and start to agree with it, I worry that it then actually does become reality. And I do a lot of plaintiffs' work too, and one of the things that comes up a lot, especially in cases where we have plaintiffs who have had injuries for years, right? And because of, for instance, a drug defect, and their life has become so different for so long that they have now normalized the pain, and they think that that's how life is supposed to be. And when I hear your call, I'm instantly transcended to that same sort of feeling of, we can't normalize this, because then we admit that it is normal, and then our kids are going to grow up thinking that it's normal. And I'm too scared to live in that place.
Yeah. We have Chris and Red Wing on the line. Chris, what do you want to share with us?
I'm a child of the 60s, and back then people protested the Vietnam War peacefully, rarely resorted to violence, and that era, that was captured when a person was placing flowers in the barrels of a gun pointed at them. Eventually the U.S. military pulled out of Vietnam because peace did prevail. We must never respond to ISIS's indiscriminate violence with more violence, as Governor Walz and Mayor Fry put it. Don't take the bait. If we respond with violence, that gives them a pretext to justify even more violence, like we've seen. And I think we are the Selma, Alabama of this time. This is an inflection point where we can make the difference, show the world, the path forward, that peaceful protest will prevail. Follow the examples of Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela. If we don't react to violence with more violence and show them that peace is the way, this could be a turning point where we can make a difference and have a different direction that this country goes in.
Thank you.
I just hope that. Yep.
Thank you so much, Chris. I mean, Sharon, I think Chris raises a really good point here. Can you help us understand how the protests that we have seen in the last few weeks fit into the history of the civil rights movement? Do you see any connections there?
Mm. Well, I think Chris raises a really fantastic point. And one of the reasons it's an important point is not just from a moral standpoint of, harming others is the wrong thing to do. It's more than that. It's that history shows us that anytime there is a good amount of forward social progress, women get the right to vote. We have equality at the ballot box for all races. Pick whatever it is. Anytime we have that forward social progress, there is always a backlash. And to what extent that backlash occurs and how quickly it comes depends significantly on some factors like how violent was the movement to bring about these rights. I think right now we are experiencing the backlash to George Floyd. Like what we're
Oh,
seeing right
interesting.
now,
Yeah, say more.
this this defunding of any university that has a DEI policy, many of which were put in place in the post George Floyd era. Right now, the government that is in power, the administration in power, is in part an answer to that type of progress. Another example is the Biden administration's reimagining of Title IX, expanding those powers, equality of the sexes, expanding that definition to mean trans individuals are also included in that. And now we're seeing the backlash to that policy. So one of the challenges here is if you want lasting change, we have to be able to acquire it by honorable means. And that is an answer that many people do not like to hear because they are tired of waiting for justice. And I do hear that. I acknowledge it, that justice is too long to come for too many people. It's a noble thing to want justice now for individuals. But we do have to be careful that by using violence, engaging in violent tactics, that the backlash will be greater than any progress that is made. And then this will all be for naught. So we must use our self-restraint in this situation.
Dillon, go ahead.
Yeah, and Sharon, I think you'll understand where I'm coming from on this too, because I agree with everything that you just said and Chris said. I think a lot of the impact that we're seeing right now, and I'll give a parallel that will speak to any teachers out there. You can get 40 reviews at the end of a semester, and 39 of them can be great. The one that is bad is the one that you will remember and the one that you will obsess over. And I can't help but wonder if, because of the nature of social media and the time that we're in, it is now at a point where when something does happen and it escalates and it gets violent and it moves, to Chris's point, beyond the threshold of peaceful protest, that is now amplified so much that it almost becomes symbolic of what's happening instead of it getting drowned out in a time where social media didn't exist and so these things didn't spread. Because I think it's natural human tendency, and certainly in the media too, when we see these things that are eye-popping and that are shocking, those are the things that gain traction. And I think then those become representative of a movement. And I think that is dangerous because I think 98%, I'm making up that fact, but I would venture that almost 100% of the activities that are happening around Minneapolis are nonviolent.
And, this is something that as a journalist, I'm paying a lot of attention to as well. It has been hard to cover some of this stuff, but also we've been getting information, videos, accounts like almost instantaneously because of social media. Yeah. Obviously, we have to be really careful too about vetting the videos that we're seeing before we tell our audience that they're accurate. As someone who has created a platform that has thrived on social media, how do you thread this needle and how do you use it for good when so much of it is often used for not good?
I've had the same experience that, when I see something and I'll send it to some of my friends in news, and the first reaction, rightfully so, is always, oh my gosh. And the next reaction is, we need to vet this. That is not happening among the average person that is online. There is no vetting because it is not a competition where it is in the newsroom of, yes, you want to be first, but also you want to be accurate. On social media, it's just you want to be first. There is no question about accuracy. And especially too at a time of AI, I think we're all sort of jumping a little bit too fast into assuming that something is real when it might not be. And there's always sort of more at play of what's going on. And in terms of how I do it, I'm not I'm a parenting creator and always have been, first and foremost, but I've also obviously done a lot of legal stuff. My sort of take on it has always been, how do I come at this from a place of allowing people the space to understand what's happening and also to feel comfortable with, maybe some differences. I think some of the most interesting comments that I get are from people that are like, wow, I'm pretty sure that I fundamentally disagree with you politically, but I really liked this. And that's something where, for me, I find that to be a huge compliment, because I think if you ask most people, I think we've lost the ability to kind of have a civil conversation. And I'm not saying that is something that is not warranted. I think in a lot of sense it is, in terms of why we've lost that. But we've lost it, whether it's valid or not, in terms of the reasons why we're here. We are. And so I think we have to figure out a way, to Chris's point, how do we dig ourselves out of this instead of deeper?
I want to get now to Winston in St. Paul. He has been waiting patiently on the line. Winston, what do you want to share with us?
I have a question. I will be quick about it, I hope. That some years ago, Congress made an attempt to reform the immigration system, and they were not able to do so. Did we miss the boat then, or is there still a chance that we might have some meaningful results from governmental legislation to improve and reform the immigration system? Or are we has there been so much heat expended that there's no hope that any light will come to bear?
Yeah. I mean, Sharon, this is a good question, right? If we could rewind the tapes and go back in time, do you think we would be in a different situation here in Minnesota?
Probably. Yeah, it's difficult to prognosticate. But I do think you raise a very important point, that there is not one single person with any knowledge of the immigration system, on any point of the ideological spectrum, who thinks that it does not need to be reformed. There is not one person who thinks this is working out great. There are many places in this country where the stated, by the government's own estimate, the stated amount of time it will take to get an initial hearing is 9 years. That is ridiculous. For it to take 9 years to get an initial hearing appointment. And that's not just some outlier weirdo statistics. These are published facts. So one of the big challenges here is that we very much need, in order to sort of dig ourselves out of this situation, we very much need to reform the system. We need to increase the system's capacity so it does not take 9 years to get an initial hearing, so that we can more quickly process things like asylum claims. To answer your question about whether or not we have missed the boat, we absolutely have not missed the boat. We absolutely have not missed the boat. The only thing stopping us from doing it is the political will. There is no logistical reason why we can't tomorrow say, here's what we're going to do to fix the underlying structures of the system so the system works more smoothly. And so we avoid some of the pitfalls that have created this inflection point for not just Minnesota, but for the entire country.
Yeah. I want to take in a question now that we got from Sunny on YouTube, who's watching. They want to know, what can state and municipal level officials do to protect their residents from what they consider to be unquestionably criminal acts being committed by ICE agents? We hear this a lot. Where can MPD not arrest one of the agents that shot Renee Macklin-Good or Alex Preddy? Say more about why we maybe are not seeing that, Dillon.
I think part of it is because we're in uncharted territory. This hasn't happened in terms of this kind of scale, and certainly speaking to people that are in those positions, I've gotten that same feedback, and they ask me those questions. And I think one of the things that we're seeing a lot is there is a hesitancy and a trepidation between what you think you can do and what you might actually be able to do, and also the realities of it. Right? If a local PD, for instance, attempts an arrest on a federal agent, and there's 10 federal agents around, I don't know any local PD that's going to do that. I just don't. And that's not a comment on them. It's just, I think, a comment on human nature. And I think this week, though, we saw some interesting developments with the police union coming out and saying we need to fix this, with the International Association of Chiefs of Police coming out and saying we need to fix this. Or I guess it was last week at this point. We did start to see some movement there, because in those letters that they wrote, they basically equivocated the same thing and said, we need guidance. We need to know what we're allowed to do. We need to know what our roles are, because I think right now it sort of feels like a lot of them are being sidelined, and that's not the career that they signed up for, and it's not the career that they want to do. And we're in this sort of weird upside down world where no one knows the answer to that, because we don't have a set of Supreme Court cases and precedent for what happens when state actors need to start disciplining or arresting or possibly taking into custody federal actors. We don't have that, because that hasn't happened. Yeah. And I think most of us could probably agree that I'm not sure we want to be in a situation where we're the test case for that.
One thing that I've been hearing a lot about in my conversations with fellow parents is navigating a time of uncertainty when you still have to be a parent, but also explaining what's happening to your kids. And Dillon, I was really struck by a video you posted on Instagram a few days ago about, having a conversation with your child. You've been gone a lot, providing legal services for people who need them. And it was really emotional. I mean, can you just tell me more about how you're navigating this as a parent?
Terribly is probably the best word to describe it. I think a lot of us are fumbling through. I had this moment the other night where, I'm fully aware that I am not an awesome dad right now, and I am not the dad that I need to be for my kids, because it's impossible to separate what is happening in my professional life and what is happening in the world with being home. And that inability to separate makes it also hard to parent. And so we've just had a lot of conversations of being honest with them, of just saying, hey, mom and dad are really stressed right now. And whatever happens in terms of if we get, a little bit more frustrated because there's toys in the ground that we step on, it is not your fault. You are a kid and you are allowed to be a kid. Our stress is not coming from you. Our stress is coming from other things. Yeah. And that's not to say that they will understand that, but I do think I've found at least that it's reassuring, because kids, especially depending on their age right now, will internalize this for years. And they will think that if you don't have those conversations with them, they will think that something happened and they are the problem. And I think that we need, as parents, to work really hard to actively push against that, so that we don't end up in a situation where our kids grow up in a world where they think that all of the problems that we faced mentally and emotionally and physically right now were on them, and they're not.
Yeah. And I mean, Sharon, former history teacher. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to add something to what Dillon was saying. I totally agree with what you're saying, that we need to make sure that our kids know that what's happening in the world is not their fault. But I disagree with you, Dillon, that you are not the dad that your kids need right now. I would say that someday when your kids are old enough to understand, they are going to look back on this moment and be like, dang, dad was out there doing things that mattered and in a moment that mattered. And that is a lesson that is far greater than I was home to clean the toys at that moment. I'm not saying there's never going to be a time in your life when you're going to return to cleaning up the toys. But I will say that this is a much bigger moment that your children will be able to look at you with admiration for than just, gosh, I wish I was here to cook dinner at 6 p.m. instead of getting home at 7:30. So I would encourage you to take heart and know that actually you are the dad that your child needs in this moment. And you're also being the dad that other children need in this moment.
Yeah. We have time for one more call. We're gonna make it quick here. We have a caller from St. Louis Park. What do you want to share with us?
Hi. So I wanted to say thank you to both Sharon and Dillon for being on here, and you as well. I'm sorry, it's Catherine, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
I listened to the program yesterday, and I also listened to it today, and I'm a big follower of NPR for many years now. I'm a young East African woman born and raised in Minnesota. And I would just like to say that I appreciate your guys' unbiased opinions and sharing knowledge and education in this moment for the public that we're all experiencing this terror. I also want to say that I think it's really valuable and important if you guys could have more young people that are millennials and Gen Z of color in these conversations, because we are experiencing this on an intergenerational, multi-level layered experience, and it's only being broadcast through social media. And I think that these bigger, larger platforms in the Minnesota and Minneapolis and Twin Cities could do a really big service to the youth, to adults, to people of all ages, to hear our voices. Those of us that are at home, those of us that are on the streets, those of us that are doing organizing, activism work. It's what's actually having things function. It's where the learning is coming from all the decades of before. We've been carrying this weight ancestrally and generationally, and that's where people are, white folks that are waking up right now, are learning from us.
Thank you so much. We unfortunately, our time is up for tonight. I wish we could continue. I want to thank our guest. Sharon McMahon is known to her fans as America's government teacher, and Dillon White is an attorney and former constitutional law professor at Minnesota State University, Mankato. This conversation was produced by Carrie Dwyer. I'm Catharine Richert. Stay warm, and thank you for joining us.
Support for tonight's program comes from CF Design, the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation, and Locally Laid Egg Company, helping create a trusted space where Minnesotans can come together, engage with one another, and better understand the issues shaping our communities. We're grateful for their support of thoughtful civic dialogue and connection. Thanks for being with us tonight.